Welcome back to Word Balloon, the Comics Conversation Show. This is John Siuntres. For over 30 years, writer Steve Englehart has been creating adventure fiction with deep characterization and strong themes that have served as the foundation for new interpretations of classic characters like Captain America, the Avengers, and the Justice League. In the late 70s, Steve teamed up with artists Marshall Rogers and Terry Austin on a seminal run in Detective Comics featuring Batman, the Joker, and one of the classic Batman love interests, Silver St. Cloud. The run has been reprinted several times, and now the team of Englehart, Rogers, and Austin have come back with a continuation of their Batman story, Dark Detective.
Joey Cavalieri, the editor at DC, I think DC wanted to do a number of Bat projects to sort of flank the movie release, and I guess Joey came up with the idea of putting us back together to do this thing.
Well, I like the fact that the tone of your Batman specifically has stayed the same, because certainly in this post-Frank Miller era, we've got a much grimmer, angrier Batman that's a little more self-motivated, and it kind of loses some of Bruce Wayne, and we've got a very human Bruce Wayne story going along with the action in facing all these villains.
Well, I think that's essential. I mean, in any strip, I think the human side of it is important. That's me, and I've always thought that I want to know who the person is who's wearing the costume, in addition to the cool part with the costume. And the two things that I did when I took over the Batman in the first place was to really do the Bruce Wayne, really look at Bruce Wayne by way of Silver St. Cloud as his girlfriend, and then conversely, really do the Batman as much more of a pulp hero, a more dead of night under a full moon fighting a maniac in a rainstorm kind of thing than had been done before. And that applied to the Joker as well. I mean, to make the Joker the more pulp murderer that he had been, as opposed to the clown prince of comedy that he had become. So I kind of took it and made Batman more Batman and Bruce Wayne more Bruce Wayne. The interesting thing now is that there were two, it's all sort of part and parcel, but your reaction has been a common reaction. A lot of people have written in to me and to DC and said, A, we really like what you're doing, and B, we really don't like, the other one, the one that the books are generally propounding. So DC has just switched editors on the books, and the new guy is going to take it in our direction, basically, bring back Bruce Wayne, bring back Commissioner Gordon, do more human interest stuff. So that, Frank Miller created a wonderful thing, but the specific thing about it was that was Batman at the end of his career, after he'd seen it all, done it all, and was reasonably burnt out. And the idea of trying to transfer that to the contemporaneous Batman, the ongoing Batman, does not seem to have been a success,
Well, it's been an interesting 20-year experiment, I guess. But and honestly, I like all forms of Batman. I think there's obviously as much validity to the Adam West Batman, the Dick Sprang, Jerry Robinson, Bob Kane studio Batman, the Bill Finger Batman, your Batman, Frank's Batman, everybody. Denny O'Neil, of course, Greg Rucka. So it's, there's too many continuity hounds, and I'm glad to see that different interpretations of Batman beyond Elseworld stories, which of course you did your share of those as well, but that we're seeing a lot of different facets of Batman, and yeah, I like this, and I like Dark Detective because in a lot of ways it's a Batman romance story. Yeah, it is.
Issue number 3 particularly, we were calling between ourselves the Batman romance book, and the first run was 8 issues long, and this one was only 6 issues long. The total page count's pretty much the same because the stories are longer now.
Okay.
But there is a difference. When you've got 8 breakpoints as opposed to 6, things have to move quicker, in a 6-issue thing. Even though you got the same number of page counts, you only have 6 climaxes as opposed to 8, and so on and so forth. And if I'd had, another couple of issues, I would have been able to stretch the romance. I would have been able to stretch everything a little bit more. As it happened, I specifically did not want to undo what I had done with Silver the first time. I didn't, it had to start off with them definitely broken up, but then I had to get them back together to get them deeply in love, and then I had to work on from there, and all that in 6 issues. So things they moved at a faster pace this time. But by the 3rd issue, that was definitely the romance issue.
And you had experience, of course, back in the 70s and early in your career in doing some of the old romance comics of the 70s. Am I correct?
Well, yeah, I just did a couple when I was first breaking in. Marvel in those days published a lot of books, and in addition to all the superhero stuff, they still had westerns, and they still had romance, and they still, they were doing some horror books and so forth. It was a place where new writers could, they could try you out. They could try you out on the sort of 2nd and even 3rd string stuff, where if you failed, nobody would particularly notice, but if you did okay, then you could work your way up, like AAA ball or whatever. And so I wrote a couple of romances. I drew a couple of romances. It was never a genre that I was deeply in love with, but I was happy to do it at the time in order to have something to do. And certainly, I mean, as I say, I wasn't particularly taken by romance books, but I do think that the human element is important in everything that I do, and romance is certainly a part of, the human condition. So I'll generally end up with some sort of love situation somewhere in these superhero books.
And Silver St. Cloud, of course, is the one woman that got away. I mean, it seems like even, Vicki Vale, Julie Madison, you go back to, the 40s and stuff, there have been girlfriends, Kathy Kane, that have kind of come in and out of Batman's life. But, Silver St. Cloud, for those 8 issues, obviously made a huge impact on the audience.
Yeah, well, that was the thing. I mean, again, there had been, as I say, I went back to the original Batman, what you called the Bob Kane studio, and Jerry Robinson and Bill Finger, those guys, to try to get a sense of the Batman. And he had Julie Madison, I guess, was his girlfriend then. But, I mean, girlfriends from then all the way through had basically been sort of arm candy. I mean, they'd show up long enough for Bruce to say, yeah, this is my girlfriend, therefore I'm a playboy. But nothing ever really happened. There was never any depth to any of that. And I really thought if I was going to do Batman the way I wanted to do it, I wanted to know who this guy was inside the mask, and the best way to do that was to give him this kind of classic romance story. It sounds sort of odd. I mean, it's worked now, so it doesn't sound so odd. But one of the things that we were all debating as we did this, in somewhere along the line, actually in the 6th issue, but I'm not going to give anything away.
No problem
about it. But Bruce has a chance to talk to Silver, but he's wearing the Bat costume at the time, and I really wanted him to say something endearing to her, and I went through this whole thing. Can the Batman actually say the word honey? It's like you can't really imagine Batman saying the word honey, and yet he is in love with her, and so on and so forth. But I eventually settled for just using her name. I couldn't. The term of endearment coming out of the Batman's mouth never made any. It just didn't sound right.
You found the line.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the point is that so doing a romance with Batman isn't the first thing that comes to anybody's mind, but you do have to kind of find that line, because again, he is the Batman. I mean, you can't just go, oh man, I'm going to turn him into a romantic hero and then forget, all the other parts of him. That is the trick, to find that line.
And you're also able to point out that it is, what Batman was that kind of drove Silver away in the first place, too.
Yeah, well, I mean, that gets back to pointing out exactly who he is. I mean, that's what I want. Who is this guy? Not what is his power, not what does his costume look like. Who is he? Because I wanted to be an artist when I started out. That's what I wanted to do. That's what I tried to do. In the end, I decided that, I could see it in my head, but I couldn't get it out of my hand the way I wanted, but I could get it out of my mouth the way I wanted, so I became a writer. I love comic book art. I love what it can do, and I love storytelling and all that kind of stuff, but I'm not an artist, so I'm going to be thinking more about the character rather than, what he looks like.
I remember that they reprinted in the 80s the original 8-issue run as Shadow of the Batman.
Right.
And then it did come out in trade. Is the trade back in print again?
I don't know if it's in print. It seems to be readily available, so it probably is.
And I would imagine when they do trade Dark Detective, they'll bring back the original story, too.
That's what they've said, yeah, that they would bring them back as two. And in fact, since they do have pretty much the same page count, they'll look pretty nice sitting next to each other, as Dark Detective 1 and Dark Detective 2. I consider the 70s run now as Dark Detective 1. I was talking about this with a retailer the other day who said, well, nobody will get that, because it hasn't been called Dark Detective before, but hopefully when it comes out in trades, people will start to get that.
We always called it, I remember the Laughing Fish story, of course. Tying it to what the Joker was doing. And again, as you did, you reach back to what the Joker originally was. You go back to that first Batman story where the Joker appears, and that is the Joker.
Yeah, that's the guy I wanted. And if you read the early, like the first year of it, they did a nice thing where every story ended with the Joker usually dying, but sometimes going to jail. But in any event, the next Joker story would always begin with how he got out of that, how he survived, how he broke jail. And I, in fact, again, I'm not going to give anything away, but when this series ends, I've got the Joker in a situation where I know how he would escape it if he was going to. I think if we do any more Batman, the Joker won't be in the next run, but I thought it was important to kind of touch base with that kind of stuff. They had a wonderful concept. I've been fortunate enough to meet Jerry Robinson. I met him in New York a month ago, and I was just in San Diego, and he was down there, and he and I have talked at both occasions, and he said that after a while they thought that in order to broaden the audience, they needed to kind of back off from the pulp stuff, and that's when they introduced Robin, and that's when they, made Batman a little less of a creature of the night and a little more of a hero, which certainly I'm not going to second guess them, and secondly, I mean, because Batman has been a success, and so that's what they felt they wanted to do at the time. I'm able to go back and look at the stuff before that when it was more of a pulp character, and the Joker was a very fearsome villain, and so on and so forth. Jerry Robinson created the Joker, and Robin, I should mention in passing. But that was the stuff that I liked, and that was the stuff, again, since they moved away from it, nobody had ever gotten back to it. So I just found that to be much more interesting to me, and apparently, it's interesting to other people too. But I mean, I liked that stuff from 1939 very much.
Sure. No, and again, that was the archetype, and that's what everything has been built upon, that foundation. Let me ask you about Marshall Rogers, obviously, whose art really. It's funny. Obviously, Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil came up with the new look of Batman in the '69 and into the '70s, and then Marshall came along with his version, and it was another innovation. And it's interesting because his art has changed again, obviously, in the 30 years since that first story.
Yeah, he says that he was just learning to draw in those days. I mean, he and Terry Austin both were young guys who were just getting into the business. They'd done some stuff, but this was their first major run, and they both, they were sort of deciding what they wanted to do as they did it. Obviously now 30 years have passed. They've all done plenty of other stuff. And Marshall now is very much into the Bat costume. I mean, he talks about how when he drew it the first time, he was just trying to make it look cool, but now he's trying to think about how would it actually work. What would be. So if you look at it, the costume has undergone some modifications over time. I know Marshall feels that those fins on the bat gloves are not just decoration; they're kind of hard rubber things that you can hit people with, and he's done a lot of thinking about this costume, which is we're all into this thing, and it's nice to have people who are, to have everybody into it, not just, one or two, but everybody. And
you put the band back together for this project, which is great. Not only Marshall, obviously, but Terry Austin, too.
Yeah, well, when Joey called us, they called Englehart and Rogers, because people say, it's the Englehart Rogers book. Nobody usually mentions the inker, when they talk about stuff, but we did. I mean, as soon as they asked us, we said, well, of course, we want Terry to ink it. And there were a number of letterers on the first run, but John Workman had been the first one, and he had sort of designed in captions where the first letter is done in a circle. I mean, that's coming out of the early comics, that approach, but he was holding up his end of it there by, being into it from the lettering standpoint. So we wanted to get Workman on there as well, and we were told that DC had pretty much given up on live letterers. They were all doing it on computer now, but we said we'd really like to get Workman, and so Joey went out and made that happen. I think he had to do a little horse trading, but but by the end of the day, we had everybody back. Not the colorist. There was no particular colorist on the first one, so we got Chuckery this time, but at least writer, penciler, inker, and letterer were the same guys.
Well, it's a beautiful production, and as you say, the 6th issue will be coming out Wednesday, and we're taping this obviously before its release, and I haven't read the 6th issue, but I've enjoyed the first 5, and I do look forward to the final chapter. I should ask you before we move on from Batman what you've thought of the movie, if you've had a chance to see it.
I like the movie a lot. I'm not convinced. Me personally, I'm not convinced that that's Batman. I kept thinking this is a very Batman-like character.
What's missing?
It's not so much missing as I'm not, the whole thing about deciding to study the criminal mind by becoming a criminal and then getting thrown into a Chinese jail where you can beat up large guys on a regular basis, that didn't strike me as anything that I'd ever heard of. I mean, it's not, see, that's the thing. It's not, you could believe it if somebody said that was the story. It doesn't negate anything.
Yes.
I mean, it fits in with the kind of character he became, but it's not, I used to write Dr. Strange, and he went to Tibet, but I'm not sure that Bruce Wayne ever went to Tibet or wherever this thing was. There was that kind of stuff that I kept thinking, it's Batman-esque, but I'm not sure it's Batman. That said, it's extremely, it's a very entertaining movie. It's very well made. It's very clever. A lot of stuff, the script was very well written, and it was very well directed. I've got nothing bad to say about it. I just wasn't convinced that it was specifically the Batman.
Okay.
But I had, again, I have my own take on it. So,
sure.
I must say, I wasn't sitting there going, well, if it's not my take, it's wrong. It's just, I didn't think it was a take.
It didn't connect with you. That's okay.
Right. Yeah.
Sure. And we should mention too that for people who haven't read the first part, Dark Detective 1, elements of that ended up being adapted for the animated series.
Well, and for the first movie, the one Michael Keaton with Kim Basinger,
yes,
as quote Vicky Vale. I mean, she was clearly Silver St. Cloud in that movie, and I mean, I know the history of that thing that they had tried from 1976 to 1986 to adapt that run. I mean, there's a number of scripts by people. It's all got Silver St. Cloud. It's all got Boss Thorne in it. Then when they filmed it, they decided that it had been so long since that book that they changed her name to Vicky Vale because it had been, 15 years or whatever, but 13 years. But the first movie is pretty much based on the run that we did. And then, yes, the animated series and everything all came out of that whole, again, going back to the 40s
yes.
approach that they had in the animation thing. And that, I think, goes back to the early thing, that in the comics, somebody decided that they wanted to take Frank Miller's concept and apply it to the ongoing Batman. But for the world at large, the movie and the animated series obviously was much more visible. And, most people, I think, in the world at large who aren't big comic book fans still resonate to the one that Marshall and I did that then had its various permutations afterwards.
I direct everyone who's listening to Steve's website, SteveEnglehart.com, because, your body of work speaks for itself, Steve. I mean, you've done so much with both of the big houses plus all of the other work as well that I know we're not going to be able to cover everything in this interview.
No.
But, no, definitely not. But we'll... maybe as new projects come up, we might be able to revisit these at another time. One thing I did absolutely want to talk to you about was your run on Captain America, which really is my favorite run of Captain America's. the hate monger, and what came out of that time. And it was certainly a volatile time in the mid '70s. Can you describe it for readers who may not have read just some of the basics of the storyline?
Well, Captain America was my first major hero. I did the Beast from the X-Men before that, but Cap was like the first thing. And when I took it over, the book was just about to get canceled. I mean, that's why they gave it to a young unknown guy like me, because it was really falling off the table. And the problem was that it was the mid-'70s or the early '70s, I guess, at that point. But the Vietnam War was going on, and there was a lot of disenchantment with America per se. And here they had this guy who wore a flag on his chest and was standing for America, but nobody knew or bothered to think it through about what that could be. So that was really, a lot of what I've just been talking about and everything that sort of defined my career came out of that, in that I said, oh, okay, if Captain America really existed, who would he be? To try to think it through, which people were just kind of vaguely embarrassed about this guy, and they couldn't make a convincing story out of a guy they were vaguely embarrassed about. And I had been a conscientious objector. I'd been in the Army, and I'd gotten out of the Army as a conscientious objector. So, I was not a big fan of what was going on with the war and so on and so forth. But I'm writing the guy. I'm not trying to write Steve Englehart comics. I'm trying to write Captain America comics. So I got into him as the spirit of America, as the guy. All the stuff that we learned in school about the good stuff about America.
Yes.
That was what he stood for. And then, so I'm doing that, and I'm writing this guy who at least is defined, and I was, trying to do a good superhero comic with it. But then came Watergate, and as Watergate broke, I thought, it's absurd for Captain America not to pay attention to that.
Sure.
It is a comic book world, but the whole Marvel conceit was that it was kind of the real world only with superheroes, and so how could Captain America continue to go through adventures but never really pay attention to the fact that the president was about to be indicted and so on and so forth. So I did an allegory. Again, it isn't the real world, so I didn't have President Nixon, driven from office. No. I had a conspiracy which, centered in the White House and left it a little vague as to exactly what that was all about. But it had this tremendous impact on Captain America that he had devoted his life to the good stuff, the higher ideals of America, and here was this conspiracy in the White House. So he quit. He gave up being Captain America and tried to recreate himself as another, continue to do the things that he did, but not do it as Captain America. And that led to a real interesting run of doing Captain America comics with no Captain America in them.
Yeah.
But Steve Rogers, the guy who was Captain America, was in them, and his partner, the Falcon, was in them. And
yes.
So I was able to continue to do an adventure book while we were exploring this whole crisis of conscience with Captain America, and that played itself out, and it just it went from being, gee, what can we possibly do with the guy named Captain America, to really delving about as deep as you can go into a guy named Captain America. And I don't say that to say, oh, I'm so cool because I did it. It just sort of seemed obvious to do it to me. But the great thing about Marvel in those days was they really, they encouraged you to be as creative and to take as many chances as you could. You had to sell the book. You had,
sure.
If you didn't sell the book, that wasn't any good. You couldn't just go off on some narcissistic thing and forget about having to sell the book. But if you could sell the book, then you could do anything you wanted to without any restrictions or so forth. People ask me, well, when you were doing this thing about the conspiracy in the White House, did they get nervous? Did they try to stop you? And the answer is no. They didn't do anything. I personally decided not to say that this was Nixon because I thought that could get me in trouble.
Okay.
And so I didn't say that, and I didn't get in trouble, so you can't prove one way or the other at this point whether it ever would have made them nervous enough to do something about it.
That could have been Bob Hope's nose. I understand.
Yeah. But as it was, we just, we could do any, there was no limit whatsoever. You could, if you thought it was cool and you thought you could sell it, then go for it. And it was a very cool time to be working in comics or anyplace else.
And you were in that generation of guys that kind of took over the nut house and really were able to really expand things. And guys like Jim Starlin and yourself and Al Milgrom and I'm
Steve Gerber,
please,
Frank
yes.
Brunner. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, Stan had been, it had been Stan writing everything, basically, except his brother Larry Lieber sometimes would, help out. But essentially it was Stan, and eventually in the late 60s it got to be too much for him, so he hired Roy Thomas and Denny O'Neil. And I know I've gone back and looked. I can say that my high point, one summer when a bi-monthly book I was doing went monthly, I was writing 5 books a month.
Wow.
Which is a lot for me. I could top out at 4. I did 4 a month for quite a long time. When Stan hired Denny and Roy, was writing 13.
Jeez.
And I would have hired them along much earlier than that, but he eventually, hired them. And so they were brought in. They were comics fans, but they were like grown-up guys with other jobs before they came into this. Roy was a teacher and Denny was a newspaper reporter. So the third generation, when a whole bunch of us came in the early 70s, me and Steve Gerber and Frank Brunner and Al Weiss and Jim Starlin and Al Milgrom and Don McGregor, all these people you just mentioned, we were the first ones who were like the audience who grew up into it. Marvel was... They always said they were big on college campuses, which they were, and so forth. And so we were the first group of people to sort of come out of the colleges and decided, and as I say, I spent time in the Army in between, but, we came out and went into it. And so we had, really internalized everything that Stan and Roy and Denny had propounded, and we showed up and they said, not only do we welcome you in, but again, you can do anything you want to do. So we were in heaven.
And before we leave the 70s, I just want to get back to Captain America and say one thing, and that is, obviously we've seen in the post 9/11 environment, Marvel move back to reconnect the patriotism aspect of Cap. And I'm just wondering how you would approach Captain America today in the midst of the war on terror.
Well, to me, Captain America is a New Deal Democrat. I mean, he became Captain America when Roosevelt was in power, when the United States was, the world was at war, and he was designed to represent the best parts of America as America launched itself into World War II and so on and so forth. So, there's no question he was a New Deal Democrat, and so, frankly, I don't think he'd be real thrilled with a lot of what's going on in America right now. I was asked recently, Marvel floated the idea that maybe I could do some more Captain America for them, and I said, well, yeah, but my guy, is involved in politics, and they said, oh, well, we're not doing politics anymore, so...
Too bad.
So I'm not going there, but that would be... Captain America would be firmly behind the troops and firmly, I don't think anything is more important to him in a situation like that than the troops. But I don't think he'd be real thrilled with a lot of stuff that's going on in Washington.
Fair enough. And also, I noticed that you had on your page a project that didn't happen, and I thought that was kind of interesting, a Bucky project. Yeah, well, Marvel in the late 80s, or I guess in the 90s actually, did a series. Kurt Busiek wrote a couple books called Marvels. Mm-hmm. Yes. And the concept was that it was like the superhero world as seen by human beings, non-superhero people. Then they were going to do a series, an ongoing comic series, and asked me to do something. And I thought, well, the archetype of the human person who gets involved with superheroes is Bucky Barnes, who was Captain America's sidekick and got to hang out with the Human Torch and the Submariner in those 1940s comics. So I did this thing, 90 pages of Bucky's
for people who don't know, Bucky eventually died during World War II when he was hanging on the wing of a plane that blew up.
Mm-hmm.
And so my whole thing takes place in that last split second before he blows up. I mean, he's reliving his life. And, you know, I did the complete story of Bucky Barnes from beginning to end. But by the time I got done with it, Marvel had licensed Captain America to Jim Lee to do a year's worth of work.
Okay.
And so Marvel did not have the rights to do a Bucky Barnes story at that point. And by the time that year was up, the Marvel's book had been canceled, and there was no place to put it, and so on and so forth. You know, there's a number of things that I've done over the years, you know, that were done, you know, with all the energy that I put into everything that I try to put in everything that I do. But for one reason or another, never came out. It's kind of, you know, now I kind of look, and I've got, you know, a dozen things that for one reason or another, the editor got fired, the company went out of business, whatever, that never got done. But I liked that Bucky thing, and it was going to be fully painted, you know, like Alex Ross. It wasn't Alex Ross, but somebody like him,
mm-hmm.
Named Bradley Parker, who was doing beautiful painted stuff.
The covers are great.
Huh?
The covers are excellent.
Oh, yeah, you know. But
what it could have, should have.
It's dead, Jim, you know.
No, I understand. And very timely, too, with James Doohan's death. So very nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
And very sad. But no, you know, you're right. And again, if you go to Steve's website, you'll see a bunch of those what-if projects that didn't happen for a lack of better classification.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to jump back to D.C. now and talk to you about your Justice League run, which apparently was happening at the same time as the detective run on Batman and Dark Detective.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I do remember reading those issues. You know, yeah, it was a neat run, and you had an important story in there that ended up getting adapted by the Justice League animated series.
Yeah. Well, when I left Marvel and was brought over to DC, what they wanted, I'd been doing the Avengers for Marvel,
mm-hmm.
which is a team book, you know, again, I'd managed to do a team book and to give each of the people in the team a personality, you know. And so when DC brought me over, they said, we want you to do that for the Justice League, because the Justice League is been around for a long time, but it's never really had, these people have never really had personality. I mean, in the Justice League or even in their own books, they've never had the depth of personality that Marvel does routinely.
Sure.
And we want you to, you know, to bring that to DC. And I said, fine, I'm good with that. But if I do that, I specifically want to do a Batman run on its own, because I love him, and that's what led to the Batman thing.
Okay.
But the original idea, you know, DC's original idea was fix the Justice League, and so I did, and I got to my thinking on that was, okay, if I'm going to have to like give all these people personalities and let you see who they are, and do a team book that has superhero adventures, there's no way to do that in a regular-sized comic. And again, DC was not as freewheeling as Marvel, but things were pretty loose in terms of what, you know, creativity could get away with in those days. And so I said, you know, let me do a double-sized book on a monthly basis. Let me make the Justice League twice as long and still put it out monthly. And that was I really liked that, because I got a chance to tell, you know, complex, large stories and still spend time with the characters.
Mm-hmm.
So I fulfilled everything DC wanted, and it fulfilled a lot of my ambitions. I've always thought that was great and would like to do something like it. About 4 years ago, Marvel came to me, and we may or may not touch on this, but I'm one of the founding fathers of the Ultraverse that Malibu did in the mid-'90s, which was a whole universe full of characters. Then the company was later bought by Marvel, and they kind of deep-sixed all the comic book stuff.
Yeah.
But 4 years ago, they came to me and asked me to figure out a way to bring at least some of those characters into the Marvel universe. And it was kind of the same thing. I said, well, if you want me to bring an entire universe in here, I can't do it in a regular-sized comic. So my proposal would start off by making it double-sized. And they said, it was interesting to me, they said, you know, back in the 70s, you could get Dick Dillon, who was the artist, to do this kind of stuff. Dick Dillon was a long-time DC stalwart, I was very happy to work with him because I like working with these guys who have been parts of the industry and made their mark and so on and so forth.
Sure.
But Marvel in the year 2001 said, there's nobody around today who could draw 35 pages a month that fans would want to see, and there's nobody that fans would want to see who could draw 35 pages a month. If Dick Dillon were around today, he wouldn't be getting any work, because the art style and so on and so forth has changed. So it makes me appreciate it even more that I had that chance to work with Dick and to do that double-sized thing and fix the Justice League.
And let's talk about Dick Dillon for a second, because he's a great Silver Age artist that I don't think younger fans are aware of. He had the longest run as the Justice League artist, and worked with a bunch of really good guys. And I was wondering too, was it your JLA JSA crossover that featured the Blackhawks that Dick was finally able to throw some Blackhawks in with the JLA?
Yeah.
Cool.
Dick had gotten gotten famous to begin with doing the Blackhawks in the 50s, and I was just exploring the whole DC universe, and I had this idea. Continuity has become sort of a bad word now for many reasons. One of which is, continuity theoretically would extend over 60 years now, and nobody can be expected to pay attention to all that stuff.
Sure.
And secondarily, because of the first part, a lot of continuity's been done badly, and so it doesn't come off all that well. But this was 30 years ago, so the Justice League had only been around for about 15 years at that point, and I just in looking over the old stories, I saw this discrepancy between. I'm not sure I even remember the details, but there was some discrepancy in the origin. Characters were not where they were supposed to be, or some such thing. So I thought of this story that would fill in that gap, and in the process, just sort of decided to throw in everybody from the 50s in the DC pantheon. So I had Congarilla in there, and I had Tom.
Roy Raymond.
Yeah, Roy Raymond and Tommy Tomorrow and the Martian Manhunter, who had not played much of a role in the Justice League. He'd been in it, but he hadn't done much for quite a long time. And the Blackhawks. It was just a question of, Rex the Wonder Dog, all these guys from the 50s, let's throw them in because it'll be cool. But specifically, as I'm thinking of that, I'm thinking, good, it gives Dick a chance to draw the Blackhawks again.
Was that the story, too, where Hal Jordan was in the book because he wasn't Green Lantern yet?
I think so.
Okay, because I remember. Yeah, now I'm really remembering that story. That was almost the untold origin of the JLA. Am I correct?
Well, yeah. Well, it was. That's what it was.
I remember that,
since then, they've revamped the continuity.
Sure.
So now apparently none of that is true anymore. But at the time, yeah, that was the untold origin of the JLA.
Yeah, and that was a wonderful story. And man, folks, go through the bins at the cons and really seek that out, because it was a neat story that in a lot of ways Darwin Cook used elements of that, I think, in New Frontier.
Yeah, you're not the first person to say that either, There's a lot of stuff. Again, people grow up on something and it really, for whatever reason, it imprints on them, and then they get their chance to do it and they draw from it. And that's kind of odd to still be here, when people are doing homages, but and you mentioned the Justice League animation series. I did do a story in there with Green Lantern and so forth, and that ended up being the opening sequence in the animated series. So
yeah,
there was a lot of stuff that came out of that Justice League.
That was the two-parter with the Manhunters coming after John Stewart. In your story, obviously Hal Jordan.
Right.
For crimes against the universe. Well, again, luckily you are able to get back to things like Dark Detective and put your thumbprint back on your own work. And, that's, I guess, the nature of the big two. It's theirs, ultimately, to do with what they want and assign the stories to who they want.
Yep.
Let's talk about John Stewart for a second, because in your Green Lantern run, you're the guy that really kind of brought John Stewart back to prominence.
Yeah, well, I took over the book. Len Wein had been writing it, and he had brought, Hal Jordan had quit being Green Lantern, and John Stewart had become Green Lantern. John Stewart, I think, was invented by Denny O'Neil in the famous O'Neil-Adams runs. in Green Lantern. But Len had sort of set this up, and then I came in the middle of it, and the general theory was, of course, John Stewart was only a fill-in, and he would go away, and Hal Jordan would get to be Green Lantern again. But I thought, that's obvious, so let's not do that,
Mm-hmm.
Why couldn't we have two Green Lanterns? And then I said, in my typical way, I kind of said, well, then why not three, And then so I brought in Guy Gardner at that point, and then we went to the whole Green Lantern Corps where we had a whole bunch of them. It just sort of trying not to, I don't want to repeat myself. I don't want to go down any road where you can see where it's going before you get there. I mean, I'd rather trick you a little more and hopefully entertain you a little bit more than just giving you what you expect. So, John Stewart never came close to quitting. I mean, he was the Green Lantern, and if Hal Jordan didn't want it, that's fine because John was there. Then when Hal did want to come back, then there's a story to be told there, and then I liked that book a lot. Green Lantern was frankly my favorite book in the 80s, and I did that one for DC, and I did several for Marvel at that time, including the Silver Surfer and
mm-hmm.
West Coast Avengers and so forth. And I liked all of them fine, but I liked Green Lantern best because it was just there was so much to play around with. Again, the whole Guardians of the Galaxy, the Guardians of the Universe, and the Zamorans and the great villains and so on and so forth. But, very quickly, John and Kat Matui, who was a red female Green Lantern from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, Sinestro's Planet, am I correct?
Yeah, Sinestro's Planet, whatever that is, but I don't remember now. They moved right in and became the lead in the book, and they were in love as these things tend to go, and it just, again, the thing just sort of grew.
Well, it was a great run. It was one of my favorite runs. And as you say, Steve, I mean, as you touch on some of your other projects, I don't mean to sell these short and not discuss them. It's just that we have a limited amount of time. I do want to hit on your Avengers run. And, first, you've had several Avengers runs, but, your classic, of course, the Celestial Madonna run, mm-hmm. which culminated into the wedding of the Scarlet Witch and the Vision.
Right.
And also your Avengers Defenders War, which was really kind of a neat little event at a time when, maybe it wasn't even being considered as such, but you tell me.
Well, again, I was a fan. I went through my college days as a fan of Marvel Comics, and they used to have annuals every summer with new, 60-page stories or long stories, longer than normal stories, and backup features and all this kind of stuff, and that was sort of a special thing that you got every summer. And so then I finally started working for Marvel, and when the first summer came around, they said, well, we're not going to do any annuals this year. So I thought, well, but I want, if I were a fan, I'd want something special this summer. So as the writer of both the Avengers and the Defenders, I thought, well, why don't I have this big war between the two of them? And again, it ran... Roy Thomas has said it's the first biweekly book ever because it mm-hmm. kind of ran in both of those books, and they came out 2 weeks apart. And again, I cannot say enough about Marvel's attitude at that time, primarily, which would be Roy's attitude because he was the editor-in-chief at the time.
Yes.
When I said to him, this is what I want to do, the only thing he said was, well, if you screw this up and the books don't come out in the right order, it's going to be a disaster, so don't screw it up. And I said, okay. And that was it. He trusted me to get these books out on time, and we did. So, so having these two super teams fight all summer seemed like it satisfied my desire for some sort of special summer thing. Right after that, I gave up the Defenders because I didn't want to write. I found I didn't want to write two team books. That's
okay.
I don't mind. I like. If I'm doing a team book, I like to pair it with a single character, or somehow so that each book is different. If the two books are too similar, then it just gets boring for me to have to to be using the same material and try to parcel it out into two different places. So, I can write different single character books because the characters are different, but teams. Even though the teams are made up of different groups, and the Avengers and Defenders were very different in terms of their membership, still there are dynamics to a team book that become sort of similar you've got to fight other teams, and you've got to do this and that. You don't have as much variety in the way a team book is done. Hopefully, you can find variety within the characters within the team book, but the demands of a team book became a lot. So anyway, I dropped the Defenders right after I got done with that thing, but I was glad to have had them both at the time. It
was a great run, and what I would also say for team books, I would think a difficulty would be, too, making sure that there's enough bits of business to be distributed throughout the team and coming up with enough scenes. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I don't have that. This is something that I've been discussing a lot lately because comics have changed quite a bit from this golden era that I'm talking about, or bronze era, or whatever it's officially called. But I mean, I consider it a golden era.
Sure.
This is going to take a little bit of explanation here. But when the Dark Detective series came out, right after the first issue was out, we were all in Detroit at the Motor City Con, and guy got up in a panel and he said, "You have thought balloons." And I'm like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Well, they don't do thought balloons anymore." Well, I hadn't realized that, but I've since thought about this and discussed this a lot. And indeed, most people who are doing comics today think they're doing movies. And so they don't have any interior monologue. And so if there's any of that, it's like done in captions, where the lead character is describing what he's thinking. But so I thought, well, that's too bad, because to me, they're not movies. They're comics, and there are certain strengths and weaknesses to any medium. But one of the strengths of comics is that you can have thought balloons. You can see what multiple people are thinking in addition to saying. And to me, if you say, well, I'm not going to do that because it doesn't resemble some other medium, you're tying one hand behind your back.
Sure.
You're throwing away some of the tools that are specifically good for you if you're doing comics. Beyond that, I had a discussion just a couple weeks ago at a con where a guy was pointing out that what you really lose in storytelling without thought balloons is the D story, which is to say, the stuff that really doesn't happen in this issue, but you're just kind of keeping an eye on it, so that when it does happen, you're up to speed. And that was a revelation to me as well. And I really have thought about that a lot. That what I always did in any team book was, the focus of the book might be on this character or these two or these three characters, but I checked in with everybody every issue. I mean, I kept you aware of what everybody on that team was doing, even if they were playing in the background in this particular arc, and a lot of that comes from people being able to say, well, so I wonder how so and so is going to handle that problem, and so 3 issues from now, when you get to the guy solving the problem, you've been effectively telling that story just in the background, but it's very difficult to do without thought balloons, because if you're just in captions, then the guy's, he's narrating what he's doing. He's not narrating about what he thinks about what the 4th string guy is going to do 3 issues from now. And I really see that now that I know about it. I was reading a team book which can remain nameless, and it really struck me that they would do like these 3-issue arcs about characters, and it would all be all about this person who hadn't really been in the book for the last 10 issues. I mean, they're in the team somehow, but you haven't seen them for quite a long time. And all of a sudden, it's like, now we're going to do a story about this person. And then when that's over, they do one about the next guy, and he hasn't really been in the book for. I mean, you lose that whole undercurrent without thought balloons. And so, what I'm trying to get back to from where you started all this is that. When I did teams, you knew where everybody was. You knew what they were doing, even if it wasn't important right here and now. And again, to me, that's important. I mean, if all 7 people are in this, or if all 7 people in the Avengers are in the Avengers, then they're all of interest somehow. And just forgetting about 4 of them at any given time doesn't strike me as the smartest way to go.
I do know, and I have to say, I appreciate the sidetrack, because I think you gave a very cogent defense for thought balloons in a way that a lot of readers maybe haven't thought of. It's funny, because I've read every issue of Dark Detective. I obviously read the thought balloons as well. Didn't bother me, and it certainly wasn't any type of stop sign, I guess, as an older reader, where it didn't bother me. And it's funny, the way that you describe that in terms of the D story. I read Denny O'Neill's Art of DC Writing, and he referred to the Paul Levitt's scripting method of starting, the germ of a story, a subplot, and ultimately 3 or 4 issues down the line that you get that fruition of that plot.
Yeah, absolutely.
And obviously you're a proponent of that thought of thinking as well.
Yeah, and so much of this, I liken it a lot to like any professional sports team, that you generally have some rookies and you generally have some veterans. And part of the veterans' job is to kind of like tell the rookies stuff that they would, otherwise they're going to have to reinvent the wheel, but also to give them kind of a concept of the overall view of things and take them beyond themselves. But, veterans who know the, who know the sport, know the industry, whatever, are always essential. But in comics, I think a lot of that has been lost. And I'm not making, this is not an argument for me per se or for any particular person who's been around for a long time, but I just think in terms of the industry, in terms of storytelling, there's a bunch of stuff that we learned from our elders, back in the 70s, and a lot of that, not a lot of it, but I mean some of it has definitely been lost. I mean, it didn't get passed down because of the Marvel bankruptcy, and people, there were fewer comics, and there's just a number of reasons, but there are guys today who are doing stuff, and they don't really know all the tools that they could have at their disposal, and thus there are readers who have never seen those tools used. And that was one of the interesting things to me with Dark Detective, is that so many people said, "Gee, this is we haven't seen stuff like this in a long time, and we like it."
Yeah.
And again, I every time I say, oh boy, people liked my stuff, it sounds to me like, like I'm egoing out, but I'm just trying to, convey the thing that there was a very definite reaction that like, we don't see this anymore, and we wish we did, wish we saw more of it. And it's kind of, sad's not the right word, but I mean, it's not like I'm doing anything that other people couldn't do.
Sure.
It's just they've sort of lost some of that stuff,
Well, it comes down to craft and how you approach craft, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah, put me on the list of people that are enjoying Dark Detective and do want to see more. And we've been strolling down memory lane, and I appreciate the fact that you're allowing me to do that, because I was a fan of yours in the 70s and 80s and 90s and still am with Dark Detective. Let's take an opportunity now to talk about any projects that might be coming up beyond Dark Detective.
Well, the way comics works, Dark Detective is a hit, and so now I'm getting offers, to do this and that and the other thing. I have done a JLA classified.
Great.
I'm going to do a JSA classified for DC.
Excellent.
Marvel has asked me and Marshall Rogers to do some stuff for them. It's not nailed down what it is yet. I mean, they've said, tell us who you'd like to do, and we'll tell you who we want done, and then wherever those lists cross, we'll work something out there. And Image came around and wants to reprint and is reprinting all my Coyote material, which is yet another series we haven't talked about. But
and I wanted to get to that, so I appreciate you mentioning that. Please go ahead.
Oh, well, I did Coyote first for Eclipse and then for Epic, which was kind of the Vertigo line of Marvel comics.
Yes.
Back, I mean, not as dark as Vertigo. Vertigo took it, another step, but Epic was before that. And this was a series that I did in the 80s, first with Marshall Rogers on the art, and then with a number of other people.
This was your and if I may, because I want to toot your horn for you for a second and say that this was really kind of the time when creators as yourself that were working in the mainstream were really kind of given an opportunity to do their own thing and come up with, some fresh concepts and stuff. And, yeah, with Eclipse, this was one of the original big indie hits.
Yeah, well, it was right at that time that I can't remember now how early in the process Eclipse was, but I mean, First Comics, Pacific Comics, there were a number of independent companies starting up around that time. Yeah, Eclipse gave me the chance to do both Coyote and Scorpio Rose, which was another thing.
Okay. And
Marshall ended up drawing both of those to start with. So now that Image is repackaging all this stuff, and it's basically remastering it. I'll come back to that in a second. But the first trade paperback, which comes out in August.
Oh, great.
I put on my sales hat to point that out. But It's me and Marshall throughout. It's the 67-page origin of Coyote and the 3 issues of Scorpio Rose, one of which has actually never been printed before, all by Marshall and me. But what's interesting, I mean, the original idea was, let's republish it. Okay, fine, that'll be good. But I found, particularly in working with Eric Larson, who's the publisher of Image now and is mostly known for doing Savage Dragon for Image and Spider-Man and other stuff for Marvel before that, he's really gotten into the concept of remastering it. So, I mean, we're recoloring it, we're relettering some of it, cleaning up artwork that didn't come out so well the first time. I mean, it's not just like, oh, we took these old books and repackaged them. And I'm not saying this is not because I have my sales hat on. I'm just saying this is kind of cool. Sure. I think that it's that this my original concept was okay. Sure, we'll put that stuff out and make it available again for people who have heard about it but haven't had a chance to see it or want to see it recolored or whatever. But it really is sort of being reworked, and I'm very pleased, if I may say, with what Image is bringing to the table on this thing. But anyway, so we're gonna bring back the Coyote that exists, and the plan is to do new Coyote and Scorpio Rose. They start off as separate features, but over the course of the original run, Scorpio Rose showed up as a separate feature. Then she showed up as a backup feature in Coyote, drawn by Todd McFarlane, I hasten to add, in his first work. And then later she actually joined the Coyote strip. And became one of the other characters in that thing. So it makes sense to put the two of them together. And so anyway, some DC work, some Marvel work, some Image work, and probably there's a few other things that are a little farther out there. But I'm doing stuff.
I'm not going to ask for spoilers, but I have to admit I'm a huge JSA fan. So any theme that you can at least throw out there that wouldn't spoil anything, or even a time period of when the story will be taking place?
Well, it's a contemporary story. Basically, it stars Flash, Green Lantern, and Wildcat, the original, original guys, and Stargirl. Okay. Totally non-original. I like Stargirl, so I don't want to diss her by accident here. But that's about all I can say, I guess, without really going down the road of telling you what it's about.
No problem. And if I may, the JLA, if you can just the barest of bones.
Well, the JLA, as we discussed earlier, when I took over the JLA before, I was supposed to give all these people personalities. So I didn't want to go back. I never want to go back and do the same thing that I did already. I mean, why would I want to do that? So, but I thought it would be kind of funny. I looked around and I picked the worst era in the JLA. Want to guess?
Yeah, would that be JLA Detroit?
Yes.
Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah.
The return of Vibe and Gypsy and Vixen.
That's right, and Steel.
And Steel. I like Steel.
Yeah, so I said, let's give these guys personalities. Let's cool. do their. See, it's interesting when you say the worst period in the JLA history. Not a whole lot of people get that one wrong. So yeah, it's a 4-part thing with the 4 characters and the Martian Manhunters in there too, and it's an attempt to kind of jumpstart all those guys after all this time. I mean, I got halfway through it and I thought, now the worst thing that could happen is if DC said, "Boy, this is great, do an entire series with these people," because even I mean, it's sort of fun to figure out what they could be, but I don't know that I'd want to be stuck with them for a length of time. But hopefully it'll be a fun 4-part thing for people who remember these guys.
No, that's cool. And, they were getting cameos in the Justice League Unlimited series.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at, I guess Vixen had a nice role, but every now and then you'd see walking around the satellite, there's Vibe, there's Gypsy, hanging out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's cool. And, they're giving them to a good guy to kind of give them their chance to shine, I guess. That's very funny. So is there any timeline for those? You said Coyote is obviously coming out in August, which is great.
Yeah.
And then any word on when the JLA and JSA stuff is coming out?
Not really. The JLA is done and in.
Okay.
It's going to be drawn by one of the new DC artists. I'm not sure whom.
Okay.
Mike Carlin's the editor, and he wasn't sure whom. But this is going to be. It's going to look like current DC artwork and so on and so forth. But they have a number, they can do that stuff and put it on the shelf. So, I mean, I don't know where it is. I mean, last time I talked to him was about a month ago, I guess, so maybe he's slotted it by now. But I have not heard where that's going to go. And the JSA has not been done. The JSA, is going to get written here in the next couple of months, so I don't know where that's going to end up either. But, hopefully it won't be like the books that never came out. But, I mean, I write stuff at some remove from when the books actually come out, and particularly in anthology things like this. I mean, they just sort of shuffle them around and decide, what the best order would be after they get them. So, we'll see when that comes out.
Well, that's cool. And, Steve, I see we've been talking for an hour, and I don't want to impose on you more than I should. And, again, there's so much that we haven't even covered. So hopefully when one of these other projects are closer to publishing, you'll join us again, I hope.
Okay, sure. No problem.
That'll do it for this episode of Word Balloon. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Make sure you come back to wordballoon.com and check in for new episodes. This is John Siuntres. Word Balloon is a copyrighted feature of Shaky Productions. Copyright 2005.